All right, there we go. Welcome, everybody. I am going to be mindful and letting people in as more people join us, but it is the June 27th, the fourth Tuesday of this month, and it is our Career Conversations Book Club. And I'm really excited to be joined today by all of you and with Liane Davey. You're going to hear a lot more about her in a few seconds. But I'm really excited because she and I had first met, sort of that serendipitous situation, in a volunteer organization that she was a part of for a lot longer before and a lot longer after I joined. And then we started continuing the conversation just online, a couple of times in person at the organization, and our paths just kept sort of crossing online for different reasons. So I'm really glad to be joined by Liane this evening, and I'm hoping that all of you are well and that you've been well since the last book club, and that you enjoyed reading The Good Fight, something that when I first saw Liane's title way back when, I thought, good fight, conflict, can it really be something that we want to talk about positively? And I'm now convinced. Liane, you've made you've convinced me for sure. So we'll engage with a conversation as we move forward. I wanted to just do a couple of quick reminders for people as we move forward. We are recording the session right now. If you want to talk about it online on social media, the hashtag is GA Career Conversations. The format, in case anybody is here for the first time or has forgotten, is over the 90 minutes, we sort of divided into a third. One third where we're going to ask Liane, after these introductions, to explain her career journey, because many of us really benefit from hearing about the career journeys of others, whether they are in law, out of law, all sorts of different possibilities, and how they got to what they're doing now. So that's the first part, is really asking and inviting our author to give us a little bit of an insight into their own career journey. I'm asking, please, for microphones to be muted for the first part of the conversation with Liane, and then also during the questions and answers for the book itself. But then in the latter part, in the last half hour, we're inviting you to please unmute. If you want to show us your video as well, by all means. That's when we're going to have the Q&A from you. So think about the questions that you want to ask Liane. The chat will be open, so if you have any questions or comments, please give us the feedback during the first little bit as well, and then have your questions ready for that latter part as we move into it. For those of you who are Ontario lawyers, reminder that this is accredited by the Law Society for 90 minutes of professional development. So your CPD hours are available, and anybody watching this at a later time, you're still eligible to obtain your 90 minutes, 1.5 hours of CPD for professionalism from the Ontario, from the Law Society of Ontario. And again, as we've said before, and I've sent this out in the email previously, I want to acknowledge the work of Elisa Canora, whose article reminded me that for some people, brave spaces can be exhausting. And so when we sometimes talk about having brave, powerful conversations, we want to ensure that this is an accountable space. And part of the conversation that we're going to have later on about conflict, we want it to be productive. We want it to be effective. If sometimes we have things that we're sharing that that we may disagree with, we want to have that conversation, but have it be respectful, understand that we're responsible and accountable for our own words, our intentions, and our actions. So I always want to start that rule as we start off the session. So with that in mind, unless there are any questions, and I'm going to stop sharing this for the next little while. Good to see all of you, and I want us to begin with Liane. Liane, welcome. It's nice to see you. You have such energy, and for anybody who's never seen or heard or read any of her things on LinkedIn, you'll understand what I mean by her energy when you see when we start the conversation. So one of the reasons, as I said, is that people really do like, and I really enjoy having being shared with the audience, with the group, how people come to the careers that they have. And so you've got, I think, an incredible career story. You're a psychologist, a speaker, an author. You just told me about sort of the Harvard HBR.
Harvard Business Review, not the Harvard Law Review. Yes.
That you are writing for as well. And you're known as the quote unquote teamwork doctor. And I love that you're the teamwork doctor. So can you share with us briefly your insights on your career journey? What do you think are the highlights? Maybe if you want to share any lowlights, but
oh yeah, it started with a low light, Gina. So first of all, hi everyone, and I'm so looking forward to this evening. And as Gina said, if you have questions you want to put in the chat in any of the stages of this, absolutely, that's what we're here for. So feel free, if you have questions about my career in the first section, just throw them in. I will be as candid as I possibly can be. So my career starts with a low point. Which was, I thought I wanted to be a doctor, went to university and flunked first year theoretical calculus. And as I refer to it, I didn't just fail it, I belly flopped it. Like I fully failed it. And so I had to change my plan. And so in my second year, I was trying to take courses that didn't have prerequisites in psychology, that didn't have a math prerequisite. And one of them was industrial organizational psychology. And I thought, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. It doesn't have prerequisites. I'll take that. And literally that was how my entire career fell into place, was from failing calculus. And I took that class. And one of the very first things we studied was how the team dynamics affected the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. And so this was 1990, I guess, would have been my second year at university. So the Challenger disaster was not that long in the past, and we were still coming to understand how it all happened and that sort of thing. And I just thought, wow, if understanding team dynamics can help us understand situations like that, I'm in. And so I literally had, whatever, that was 1990, so 33 years ago. And that was me sunk. I knew exactly what I wanted to do forever. And so from there, just went all the way through to PhD in organizational psychology, worked in a couple of different consulting firms. And then 8 years ago, my husband and I decided that we were tired of working for other people, and he's a PhD in neuropsychology. And so we both quit our jobs, jumped off the cliff and started our company. So today we really work primarily with CEOs and executive teams at the intersection of business strategy, team effectiveness, innovation, those sorts of things. And then everything that I learn behind closed doors, I try and share generously with the world through books, blogs, a YouTube channel, whatever else. So that's it. There we go.
There we go. I love the start off point, or the jump off point, Liane. And
jump off. It was like a fall off.
Complete fall off, right? And then it hit you for life, though. It's something that you've been engaged in on a regular basis throughout. And the moniker of teamwork doctor, something you came up with, or came up by before you?
Somebody else came up with it. When you do a lot of keynote speaking, every once in a while you'll be introduced by somebody who knows you, and so they often go off script, and just somebody just decided that that's how he was going to introduce me. Was one of the things that happened was I do have a PhD, but I tend not to use doctor very often. I just didn't want to be pretentious. Or my dad used to say, if you can't cure my hemorrhoids, you're not a real doctor. So I just kind of I don't use doctor very often. And it was interesting because this gentleman who was the MC of this big event I was doing, he was like, all the men use doctor. Why aren't you using doctor? Why are you not kind of loud and proud on that? And I said, well, I don't want to tell people I'm smart. I want them to listen to my talk and decide if I'm smart or not. And so he respected that, but I think he's like, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to call you the teamwork doctor. I was like, okay, you go for it. So that's kind of how it happens.
I love it.
So thanks to Bill Williams, who coined the teamwork doctor.
The teamwork doctor. Now, one of the other passions that you have, and given that, sometimes in our careers, the extracurricular things that we do very much inform the work that we do, and vice versa. Do you want to speak a little bit about the some of the volunteer activity? I'm thinking primarily the
Strong Minds
Foundation.
Yeah. So where Gina and I met is an organization now called Strong Minds, Strong Kids. And it's one of the very, very few organizations in the country, if not the world, that takes a proactive and a preventative approach to children's mental health. So this organization starts from birth. We have programs that go from 0 to 3 around promoting healthy attachment. We move into stress and resilience programs, and now all the way through to the end of high school. And believing that if we don't instill and instantiate in kids the skills to manage stress, be resilient, deal with anxiety, if we don't do that proactively, then first of all, things to try and fix a problem are less effective, they're more costly. And it's cruel to set someone up for those sorts of things. So I'm super proud of the organization. Tomorrow night is my last night. I'm stepping off. I served, the term is 3 years on the board. I served 3 years. They extended me for 3 years. That was the term limit. I had to step back for 3 years. Then I've done another 6 years. And now I've said, okay, so I'm just starting to work with a new organization called Inspire, which is an educational charity for Indigenous youth. So I just decided Strong Minds has had me for, has had 12 years, over 15 years, and time to bring what I have to other things. But as you say, you learn so much. And I think one of the big intersections, and if anybody got to the final chapter of the book, you'll know that the big intersection for me was, I believe we're not raising conflict resilient children. Mm-hmm. And I believe without those conflict skills, we've been sort of bubble wrapping our kids, thinking that we're protecting them from things and ultimately robbing them of the kind of self-esteem and life skills that you need to function in the world. So I was just really passionate about that intersection point. But now it seems that I think Indigenous youth really need my support. So I'm shifting over to that for now.
Well, thank you for all your service to the one organization. I'm very excited for the new organization that you're going to provide some additional guidance and support and energy for. So that's fantastic. Yeah. And, it's funny because you talk about the work that you've done with CEOs and large corporations. And as you think about that last chapter, we'll get to that last chapter, but talking about children, resilient children, and how they learn teamwork or team dynamics, it's not something that is taught necessarily. Not necessarily, no. Leave out the necessarily. It's not something that is taught
rarely
in our system, right?
Rarely. The only exception, one of the exceptions I know of is the Good Fight has been for a couple of years curriculum for the executive MBA program at the Smith School at Queen's, which is really exciting for me to know that because these executive MBAs, first of all, they're paying $100,000 for their education, and their grades and their performance is all tied up in teamwork. And they just realized that we can't just hope that works. We need to support them. So I think the Smith School is really going a long way in investing in some of those skills, but that is by far the exception. Certainly, like even my kids, if I think about what they hate the most, I have a daughter going into 4th year at McGill and a daughter going into grade 12. They get saddled. Like, so if I think about the younger daughter, she's going into grade 12, she really wants to go to McGill like her sister. Seems these days it takes approximately a 94, 95 average to get into arts at McGill. Mm-hmm. So trying to get a 95 average when you are in group projects with no control over whether you're with a bunch of slackers or it's horrendously anxiety provoking. And there are no skills. The teachers don't even know how to support effective teamwork. I don't think they know how to grade all these things. And so, I think it's a real gap. And then the problem is employers inherit that gap, and managers don't exactly know how to teach it either. So I think it's a growing issue, and there just is so little work left anymore that isn't collaborative. So the cost to our economy of our inability to collaborate effectively or work in teams is getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know that there are a couple of people who we've had parenting conversations. We'll move off of this topic and move on, but parenting conversations, and there are some educators on the call, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But it's interesting how we're expecting collaboration in the workforce, yet not giving anybody the tool, or very rarely giving people the tools, whether it's the manager, whether it's the people who are engaged in collaborative work or in school. So it is a huge gap, and we can think of ways of addressing that at a later time. But let's move on. You and I, you knew in early university that because of that one grade that you were destined in this way. Along the way, though, with the different opportunities that you've had, have you planned each and every stage? Because people sometimes ask me, okay, I should sit down and plan exactly what I want to do for the next year, for the next 5 years, for the next 20 years. Has it all been planned out so perfectly, Liane, or has it been a little bit of serendipity? That face tells me maybe not.
So I've had 3 inflection points. So the first inflection point was finishing my PhD. All through the 5 years of graduate school, I was going to be a professor. I was the only one in organizational psychology who didn't want to be a consultant. Everybody else wanted to be a consultant and were complaining that the program wasn't applied enough. But I was like, no, professor, 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 professor. So I actually had an academic contract. I was going to be a professor. And somebody said, I want you to meet this consulting firm. Like, I interviewed with them. I don't think they're right for me, but oh my God, you'd be amazing. And so I had a conversation with them and they said, well, our partner's in London, so we'll have to fly the partner in to meet you. And so they flew the partner in and I was having lunch with the 2 of them. And they're saying, okay, we want you. Like, what do we do? And I said, well, I have to have a signed contract to the university by noon tomorrow. So if you can get in before that. And they kind of looked at each other and they said, yeah. So I went from literally having the contract to be a university professor, which had been my lifelong dream, in my hand, to 12 hours later, taking a job in consulting. So that was a like whiplash moment, not planned at all. In fact, the diametric opposite of that. Like, it was totally counter to plan. Couldn't have made a better decision in my entire life. Can't even imagine being a university professor. So that was the first inflection point. Completely unplanned. I spent 6 wonderful, wonderful years at the first consulting firm. But in some ways, I outgrew it. I kind of too quickly, they were looking to me for too many things. I was like, I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. Like, what? I'm too young. This is wrong. So I described my next move as needing to be repotted. Like, this pot is too small. My blooms are constrained. I need a new pot, and a new pot that allows me to sort of grow a little bigger. So I moved from one consulting firm to another, which was moving from an HR consulting firm that felt a bit constrained, felt a bit, I don't know, just a little too procedural and HR-y, to a firm that allowed me to move toward doing strategy work, working with more senior audiences. And that was a firm called Knightsbridge, which was a fairly famous Canadian firm, a really amazing place. I got to be in leadership there to really build a business, and 10 amazing, amazing, amazing years. And then at some point, it just became clear to me that it was time for me to control my own destiny. It was time for me to build something I wanted. It was time for me to have way more vacation. And so I was really struggling because I felt like I was in this 10-year monogamous relationship with Knightsbridge. I was very bonded. I loved the people. It was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful place. And one day we got sold to a big US part of a global conglomerate. And the true story is April 15th, 2015, I was giving a keynote speech in Calgary. The first speaker of the day, her name is Liz Wiseman. If you haven't read her books, she's phenomenal. And she was giving a speech, and I'm just listening to her, waiting to give my speech. And she has a slide with 8 bullet points, the 8 ways you know you need to quit your job. And at about number 5, I kind of like looked up. Like, like all the first 5 are all true. And so were the final 3. And so literally before she finished her talk, I'm like, well, okay, I guess I better quit my job. And then the next speaker was Brene Brown. And if any of you know Brene Brown, I was like, okay, I'm toast. Like, now I clearly have to quit my job. And then I was next. So I'm trying to collect my thoughts.
After Brene Brown. Yeah.
I'm like a mushy mess of like, I gotta quit my job. So I got on the plane, and on the way home, I built the company in a notebook on the plane. This is going to be our mission statement. So the company name is 3 Co's, but the name came after the mission. So the mission is to radically transform the way people communicate, connect, and contribute so they can achieve amazing things together. And only later did my husband finally figure out that when we wanted to name the company, I kept saying we were looking at like Connexus, or we were looking for names that played off of these words. And he's like, I said, I just want something that plays off the fact that it's 3 co's. He's like, how about 3 co's? Oh, brilliant.
There we go.
And so I landed with this whole business plan in a notebook. And when I land from these things, I always text Craig and just say safe and sound and on the ground. And he said, great. How was it? I'm like, awesome. Quitting my job. He texts back, okay, talk when you get home. And by the time I got home, he goes, can I quit mine? Can we do it together? And it was like, yep. and that, like, literally, like,
That conference made a difference for both of you then.
And you know what? I was at the Thinkers 50 event in London, England in 2019 and got to meet Liz Wiseman and got to thank her and got to say, yeah, that slide changed my life. And so that was a really fun moment to have the chance to say, hey, you know, I was one of the other speakers, but you know, I was listening, and thank you. So yeah,
how fantastic. And I just realized as you talked about the 3 co's, that's part of your book as well. Because as you were describing it, yep, that you're using that in all parts of it. So I'm going to put a question up, or there's actually 2 questions up. And if people want to think about it and answer it, I'm curious for this group and for those who are watching it later, think about this aspect for you. What percentage of your professional life is conducted in teams? Many of us think, oh no, I'm a solopreneur, or I'm, you know, I'm working as a teacher and I've got my own class, or I'm working as a lawyer as a, you know, independent. How much of that, though, is really independent? So think about that in terms of how much collaboration you do. And the second question, if you want to give any thought to it, and if you want to share it in the chat, have you had any training in teamwork? So I'm just going to put those off to the side, get people thinking about that if they want to contribute to it. I see, Ivana, you're thinking about that, doing the math potentially, but we'll leave that as an aside as we delve into the book. And I wanted to ask you, as I ask all of my authors, the first question: what is your why? Liane, why did you have to get, you know, sorry for my tabbed book, but The Good Fight.
I apologize for that.
Out into the world. Why did you think that this was an important topic to research and to write and to share then?
Yeah. So if you go back to the mission statement of, you know, helping people achieve amazing things together, one of the biggest things that gets in the way of achieving amazing things together is our avoidance of conflict, or our, you know, completely clunky attempts at conflict. And I had written a book previously called You First, and there was a chapter in that called Embrace Productive Conflict. And what I found was the most common thing that people would, out of all the book, would say, okay, but I need help with this, or how do you do this, or was that chapter. That's what we struggle with. You know, I don't know how to have conflict and not slow things down, not be a jerk, not stress myself out, not, and still be able to look at myself in the mirror. So just so much after that second book led to the third book. It was just, if people are going to achieve amazing things together, they can't be always walking on eggshells. They can't be wounding each other with so this just, and of all of the things, it was the one that I put in You First, knowing that I needed to read the messages as much as I needed to share them. So I have a long track record of writing the book I need to read. So it's a physician heal thyself kind of scenario. And if there's anything I suck royally at, it's for sure conflict. So it was definitely like, okay, Liane, and, you know, there's no better accountability mechanism for getting yourself to, you know, actually stop avoiding conflict than to publish a book about it. Then people are kind of like, well, you're supposed to be good at this. Like, right. Yes.
No, I love that. You made me remember I was going to get the photo, and I thought, no, I'm not going to do this to you. The whole idea of teamwork being, you know, that, and the image was so vivid. I've seen it, you know, the great teamwork picture of the rowers all together, right? Everybody together. And isn't that what great teamwork looks like? And you got me to pause. And I don't know if anybody else got to that when you got to that part of the book. It's like, oh, the wonderfully glossy photo that we've all seen. Really, there's another way of thinking about teamwork that isn't necessarily everybody is rowing in the same direction. So
I can tell you my funny story on that one, because in my keynote, I actually I make fun of the rowers, and I was at one of the big accounting firms, and I did that. And somebody came up to me after with the copy of their annual report, and it had the rowers on the front. I was like, oh.
So I'll tell you that I'm joining a dragon boat race team starting in, I think it's in 2 more weeks that I have to start. And I've got this vision that we should all be doing that. So I'm going to be thinking about
True.
this conversation.
If you're actually rowing,
Okay, maybe
you should do that.
Fair enough.
But it's a terrible metaphor for what teamwork looks like
I appreciate that.
anywhere other than in a dragon boat.
Fair enough. So we can be doing that. We can be doing that. So tell us about conflict debt. That's one thing that you talk about it repeatedly, and it's in part of well, it starts off the book and you come back to it. It's sort of the foundation. What's your summary? How do you identify it? And I love the fact, and if others, had that thought, you remind us that conflict debt is something that we can incur in an organization, in a team, and even in ourselves as well. So can you give us a little bit about conflict debt?
Yeah, I was looking for a metaphor. Like you will now, if you spend 90 minutes with me, my rate of metaphors per minute is usually very high. So I apologize. I think in metaphors. And so I was looking for something that would help people grasp the fact that it can be much more debilitating and costly to avoid conflict than to have it. And finally, I thought about it. It's like, oh, I know what it is. We think that we can afford to put off conflict, just like we think we can make certain purchases and that, oh yeah, like I'll start making payments on that. It's no problem. And we really overestimate how much we pay in interest and penalties when we try and defer these things. We pay a price. Just like with a credit card, you pay a price for the privilege of deferring payment. The exact same is true with conflict. So that conflict debt metaphor, it's great because I don't even need to be around for someone to say that term and other people to be like, oh, I know what that is. I've felt that. I've been there. I've had that, huge account piled up with somebody and I can't figure out how to pay it off. I feel like I need to declare bankruptcy. And so the conflict debt metaphor started. And what I love about it is that I've sort of crowdsourced other bits of the metaphor. And so I did in my first job end up declaring bankruptcy because I got so far into conflict debt. I was young and I didn't know how to get out. But then I was at this wonderful organization talking to the folks about this, and somebody just said, here's the problem, Liane. I know I'm in this conflict debt. I don't want to declare bankruptcy, but I think I've destroyed my credit rating with the people and I was like, okay, that's a brilliant addition. Mm-hmm. And then another friend called me one day. He'd been asking some advice about a fight he was having with his wife. And he called me from the car after leaving home. And he's like, is it okay to just make the minimum payment? Like, yes, that's okay too. So what I love about conflict debt is I think it, people get what it means just when you say it, but also that people can kind of keep it going and make it their own and add so much color to it. And it really does apply. So, when we have conversations, issues, things that we really need to be able to address to move forward, and we choose to go around them. And I talk about 3 different ways that we get into conflict debt. We can either just make it the undiscussable. Secondly, we can talk about it, but avoid the opposition, which is really what silos are like in organizations. So often you'll see, well, we're just going to plan this and we're going to decide that we want to do this and we're going to keep it going. And then at the last minute, we're going to give it to these folks and tell them that there's no time for them to have input. They just have to do it. So silos can really be a form of conflict debt. And then the third kind of conflict debt is, we do broach the subject, but anytime it gets a little like, ooh, getting hot in here, we like take it offline.
Yeah.
And bury it in a deep dark hole and never speak of it again. So yeah, that's where conflict debt came from. And I love that it seems to have legs.
Yeah. Of those 3 that you mentioned, let's not discuss it. Let's silo it, or let's take it offline.
Yeah.
Do you find that one is used more than often? I would think that let's not discuss it is, but maybe I'm just curious. That
and silos. Yeah, a lot. So I'm working with a software organization in Silicon Valley at the moment. And like we were in their executive team meeting yesterday, and like marketing and sales really just wants this thing to be true. That's a promise about the technical capability of their product. And engineering's like, it just isn't true. So they mostly just, yesterday they tabled it to say, can we just like agree to like ignore this. Like, no. So, I think silos is actually pretty common as well. So both of those two.
Yeah, and when I think about, whether it's a law firm or professional services firm or in an academic setting for that matter, there are so many times when there are those conflicts that are coming up. And as you said, I've seen them fester, and I will say fester for years, because maybe it's siloed or maybe it's taken offline and then buried or just not discussed. And this could be something that builds. That is one of the toughest parts, I think, is that it just builds. And then do you ever forget what the actual conflict is about? Yes, it's just that.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely, you do. Yeah, the story I tell about the doctors at the very beginning of the book, I think the key decision that got them into conflict out was like 15 or 17 years prior.
Yeah.
I'm like, what? Yeah,
How
you're
many
calling me in, like, it's the same. It's like, I'm trying to say to them, like, if you have a patient that walks in and is like, yeah, I've had this cancer for 15 to 17 years, but like, you can fix me, right? No, no,
Yeah.
like, just let me just chop it off, because you're like, no. And that's how profound conflict that can be in some places.
Yeah. So I thank you for a couple of people who've responded in terms of how much teamwork they do, and whether it's 40% or whether it's 10%, and some trainings not, and other Nora, you've said that you've had training in leading effective teams earlier this year. So, later on, I'm glad to see some training, but how many years did it take before you had that training, right? So it is something that we don't often talk about. And the next question that I've got for you, Liane, and it's sort of thinking about these teams and the organizations, and even for ourselves, conflict avoidance versus conflict aversion. And it was funny because I hadn't really thought about that distinction until you really, I just avoid conflict. Or do I avoid it, or am I averse to it? There is really that distinction between it. And that really hit home. You mentioning that you keep using the phrase, and I loved it because it took me back to a coaching class that I had, the itty bitty shitty committee. And that those things that go on in your mind, right? The narratives, the stories. Yep, you did that. Those little people that are coming up in your mind. We're not wired for conflict from nature, as you remind us. So how do we address this whole conflict aversion versus avoidance? How do we get, because anybody who wants to admit I'm conflict averse at times, anybody else, or who's comfortable? Okay, there we go. I'm just wondering who are uncomfortable with conflict. There we go. Anybody not uncomfortable with conflict? You don't have to share it with us, but I'd love to know if somebody feels really, really good about it. But talk to us a little bit about how to
conflict aversion is just like, I don't like it. A conflict avoidance is I don't do it. And so for me, it all became clear when I put it into the context of fitness. I despise exercise. I don't like it. But what was happening is I was starting to get a really sore back because I had abdominal jelly. And so all week working in my job, I'm usually on my feet and facilitating all day and standing in airports. And I was getting a really sore back. Going to Canada's Wonderland was excruciating. And I started to realize that I may not like fitness, but I need to go do it because it's making the rest of my life unhappy. And so if I can do 15 minutes of ab exercises 3 times a week, those 15 minutes are always going to be awful. After years and years and years, still hate it, still averse to it. And yet knowing that I can not like it and still do it, that those are two very different things. And then all of a sudden, my back wasn't hurting anymore. I could travel and walk and stand all day and all those things. I was like, okay, so 15 minutes of discomfort 3 times a week to feel good all the rest of the time, totally worth it. And I literally had the epiphany first about fitness. And then I was like, oh, conflict is same. What are 3 uncomfortable conversations I could have during a week that would make the whole rest of the week better? So, that was important. And understanding that. So my favorite conflict aversion thing goes even before the itty bitty shitty committee. And it's since I wrote the book, I learned of somebody asked the anthropologist Margaret Mead about how far back the evidence of humans as sort of collaborative, community, harmonious creatures goes. And she said, well, the earliest evidence I have is they have a 15,000-year-old femur bone. And there's evidence that the femur bone completely broke and completely healed. And so she said that means that for a minimum of 6 weeks, somebody protected that person, brought them food, all these other things. So I would say if you're conflict averse, cut yourself some slack. 15,000 years of evolution has gone into making you want harmonious relations with people who are in your in-group. So that's where it starts. Then we're raised by the itty bitty shitty committee, giving us so much bad advice about, like, if you can't be nice, wait, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Okay, I've said that line like 7,000 times. It just left me. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Mind your own business. Don't make somebody else cry. Be good or you'll get, you get in trouble. All of this crap that we've been told, especially conflict isn't professional. It's not ladylike. It's not polite, all that crap. And so, it's bad enough that everything inside of us is already making us conflict averse. Now we've got all these lessons. And then, as I tell the story in the book, in my very first job, it was, I gave 360 feedback to somebody and their boss yelled at me for giving them feedback on the 360. I was like, why are we doing a 360 if we're only allowed to say nice things? Like, what? So there's just so many members of the itty bitty shitty committee giving us bad advice. So no wonder we're conflict averse. So the secret is to understand that there are bigger fish to fry, more important things at stake in having conflict. So to appeal to something bigger. So whether that be, there's an expertise I bring to lawyers have to do this all the time, right? No one else sees this issue the way I see it. If I don't speak up, we are introducing risk here that nobody knows about. We can't mitigate. So there may be expertise that you bring that no one else brings. There may be a stakeholder that's not in the room that you are the only one advocating for. If I don't say this, like no one else is going to say it. So as we understand who we're fighting for, what we're fighting for, it gets a lot easier. It's not me being a jerk. It's not me, just trying to be annoying. It's me living up to the obligation I have in having this role, in being a member of a team, those sorts of things. So we go from, it doesn't mean we're ever going to like it. So I just know I'm 51. I will die conflict averse. It's just how I'm wired. But I, at about 40, decided I would not be conflict avoidant anymore. And mostly because a healthy family is worth fighting for. The people I represent when I'm facilitating, they're worth fighting for. I know what's at stake, and I will always, rally to live up to that obligation now that I kind of understand it.
Yeah, I appreciate the reminder, your title, The Good Fight. There are fights that we want to fight, and it doesn't have to be a nasty fight. It's just something to move us forward. And I think, from the time that we don't say anything at a restaurant when an order is wrong, or when they ask, was everything fine with your food? Oh, it was cold. It was but finding ways just to broach that is not being nasty or being mean. It's just giving feedback to somebody. Sandra, I appreciate the reference, and I don't know, we'll take it offline. We won't take it offline, but it's a good reference, the nice girl syndrome. I love the title of the book, The Nice Girl Syndrome. So I'll have to look at that one as well. Yeah. And yeah. Is that
well, and just wanting to be liked, wanting so desperately to be liked. And it took, a few years into my career before I figured out, like, the reason that I get to work with CEOs of super cool companies is I finally realized that everybody wants to be liked, and almost nobody is willing to live up to the obligation to tell these people what they need to hear. And once you start, then you become so valuable and your name spreads. I don't ever make a sales call. I get the like, so I hear you. Like, yep.
You're going to tell the truth here. You're going to be able to get to the nitty gritty. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I am definitely the girl who wants to be liked. But fortunately, I came to understand that I'm valued much, much, much more. And then I can be liked by being fun, by being lighthearted in hard conversations, by using humor to broach difficult topics. Like, those things can make me fun and make me liked. But if that's in the absence of the hard things that people need to hear, then I'm not valuable.
So part of the hard things that people need to hear, or part of the hard things that people need to do, you referenced it in your book, and I think and you had a LinkedIn article, is the bystander role. When we think that there's nothing that we can or should do, and we've heard that phrase a while ago, but you show us in the book. It really doesn't help when we don't say or do anything as a bystander.
Awful.
Yeah, can you explain why? Just so that we're all on the same page. What is it about the bystander role that you referenced?
Barbara Coloroso wrote this really great parenting book years ago called The Bully, the Bullied, and the Bystander. And she showed how bullying is a social dynamic. And actually, it's the bystander with considerable power to end bullying. The bully is doing it to gain social hierarchy, to gain social stature. And that's to gain social stature in the eyes of the bystander, not the bullied, right? And so, and if people don't, there's some gross research about what happens in bystanders' heads. Like there's this arousal that happens when you see somebody being bullied. It's a very animal part of our instinct. And so she showed that if the bystander steps in, this was one of the great things we got to do through Strong Minds, Strong Kids, is to hear some of the expertise on this. If a bystander says something as simple as, hey, stop that, in something like 74% of the incidents, the bullying is done within 15 seconds. Yeah. And so I borrowed from that in the book You First, and kind of framed it in teams as there's wicked behavior, wounded behavior, and witness behavior. And all three of them contribute to an unhealthy team dynamic. But the most likely one for us to be able to change is the witness behavior. So if you're behaving wickedly, either you might be wicked or you might just not have a better way or whatever else. But again, it's hard to change that. It's even harder to change someone who decides that they're the victim. So in many cases, it's actually the wounded person that needs to leave a team to rehabilitate it rather than the wicked one. But both of those are harder things to change. But the person who chooses to witness it and allow that social dynamic to come on to happen, that's where we have the most ability. You're less emotionally involved. You're probably hearing better. You are not in the midst of a stress response. And so if we can get people to stop being bystanders, be better than a bystander. So my LinkedIn newsletter last month,
I think so,
very recently, was all about, what are our alternatives to being a bystander? Because it really is the place where we have the most leverage.
Yeah, no, it hit home for many reasons. And then the other part that hit home, I think it was, let me just double check, in chapter 3 that you made a point, all of the and I'm going to read from it, all of the strategies for productive conflict in this book are based on the assumption that you want the conflict to be productive. If all you want is to win or to dominate or ram your ideas down other people's throats, then know the techniques in this book are not for you. So my question at that mind, I ran through a couple of scenarios in my mind and I thought, so what if this is your boss or your colleague? Can you still make things work if that other person really doesn't want, like you were giving examples where the CEOs or the managers were open to productive conflict. Yeah. What happens if it's not the case?
So sometimes you can. Sometimes you can appeal to the business issue that is, less effective because of the behavior. That's normally what I would do when speaking truth to power. So I would often frame the issue in terms of, I know for you, revenue is the most important thing, or I know you're really looking at our utilization rates, or like to frame it as something that they do care about. Mm-hmm. They may not care about the like mamby-pamby team members, snowflake, whatever, but if you can frame it in something they do care about, and if you can demonstrate how different behaviors would get them more of what they want, as opposed to framing it in what you want or what others want, sometimes you can do that. Sometimes what you can do is, and this is what You First was all about, what happens if your boss is a jerk? Well, sometimes you and your colleagues can band together and have a big impact, and be able to really mitigate some of the risk of a bad boss. But there are other times where the best you can do, I always say, if you can't make a dent in the problem, reduce the dent it makes in you. And sometimes that's the case. So in a recent blog, I shared a technique which is really about shifting the power balance with somebody who's really a problem. And in that case, what I do is I say, okay, what are the things your boss says that just are like a gut punch, that are kind of crippling? And usually those bosses have a few go-to lines that just cause you to crumple. And then find a trusted partner and start treating those lines that your boss uses as like getting a loyalty punch card at Second Cup. So when they say them, you're like, oh, and then the deal is when you get whatever number of punches in the card, you get to go for what I call the venting session. So I get a venti half sweet chai latte. That's my drink of choice for the venting session. And so what happens as soon as you do this is that you go from the situation where them saying that to you is crippling, to now they say something like that to you and you go, yep, one for me, one closer to my venti latte. And it's fascinating how when you can shift the power dynamic in your own head, they don't need to know anything about this, but they cease to hold the same power over you. You will find there's so much more breathing room, so much more is possible in that case. So you can go all the way from, trying to give them feedback, trying to alter their behavior by clinging to some kind of an important outcome for them that needs to be different. If they're not going anywhere, you can rally together with your teammates but if your teammates are also somehow not on board, then it becomes, how do I cope with this, at least in the interim, until I can find a path somewhere else, build some other bridges out of my team, or those sorts of things. So yeah, lots of options.
That's actually really helpful. And I think people, jump to I've got to leave right away before trying 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's really helpful to know that there are other opportunities other than
there
just.
are. And the thing is, when you use that third technique, which is not the high road, let's all be clear, but when you use it and you know that it will work for you, you gain this confidence that I can ride out things. And with that confidence, your brain even interprets new situations differently than it would have when you're in that wounded. And a little bit of that problem is that you do start to be wounded. You start to tell yourself a story about how horrible your boss is, and you don't own any of this. And that's almost never the case, right? There's almost always something you can do to make the situation better. So yeah, I really encourage people not to jump to, I got to get out of here. And if you try some of these things and have even limited success, your confidence goes up and you have more options in the future. So yeah.
And more energy at some point too, as you move forward. So we've talked a lot about part 1 of the book. It's a strong foundation that you need to move on to part 2 of the book. And this is where your 3 co's.
Yeah, 3 co's. Yeah.
Co's or cozy? Co's, right?
Co's, yeah. 3 co's. Yeah.
So second part, you tell us and show us through communication, connection, and contributing to solution. Can you speak briefly about each of these elements and how they contribute to supporting or practicing in this area?
Yeah. So communication is really that so much organizational conflict and so much conflict everywhere is that we just don't connect with each other. So we don't communicate from the Latin to make common, and we are constantly communicating at one another, which is not actually making anything common. And we need to stop and communicate with each other. So what does effective listening look like? How do we frame our comments in ways that don't evoke defensiveness and that sort of thing? So lots about communication. Connection is really about trust, and how do we, so what are the 4 different things that are foundational to trust? How do we strengthen our connection, increase our credibility, demonstrate our reliability, and sort of ooze integrity? So ways to proactively. So a lot of people kind of feel like, they don't understand that trust is a choice. Trust is a verb, and you can proactively do things to make it more likely someone's going to choose to trust you. So getting those 4 levels is really important. And then the third piece, contribute. So chapter 6, conflict strategies for nice people, is some techniques for how do you use the right words to, move toward a solution in a way that's less likely to make people defensive, that validates the other person, that really seeks not just forcing your truth on them, but exposing their truth, and finding solutions that work for both of you. And so the whole middle section of the book is really about the mechanics of productive conflict.
The reality, as you mentioned, that trust is two-way, and that it's not just for us to be trusted, but for us to actually trust others. That was almost, I do one of those, oh God, another one of those, oh Liane, thanks for telling me the truth about that. We always think that you just can, others need to gain your trust, but
Yes.
being more trusting is, and I love the examples where you used, where you may want to try offering trust even when it's not necessarily there at beginning, just to build on that, right? That was mind-blowing for me, that
people normally have their minds blown by that idea that you can behave something before you believe it.
Yeah.
And I think we tend to work on this assumption that I have to believe they're trustworthy before I behave as if they're trustworthy. And that's just not true. So I always say, behave it, and then you'll believe it. That's cognitive dissonance at work. When our beliefs and our actions are misaligned, we tend to change our beliefs. So you just use cognitive dissonance. It's like a corollary, just use it in reverse. Okay. So if I want to believe they're trustworthy, if I start behaving as if they are. So if you're thinking to yourself, I wish I didn't have to go to this meeting, and if I trusted that person, I would let them speak on my behalf and I wouldn't go. Okay, great. So just tell them you're not going, behave it, say, hey, I'm not going to go to this meeting. But it's really important to me that you share this point on my behalf. And and you'll see. The other thing that's amazing is that vulnerability begets vulnerability, literally through a process of the release of oxytocin. And so when you make yourself vulnerable to that person and you say, I'm counting on you to share this in the meeting or whatever, your vulnerability tends to get that reciprocated. And so they're much more likely to actually represent you in the meeting. So you can definitely behave things before you believe them.
I'm going to ask this question, especially when you use the word vulnerability and the concept of vulnerability. There's a number of women on this call right now, others who are watching later on, and some men who will be watching later on. Any gendered thoughts on this? Is vulnerability only for women, or do I know that's not the case, but because you mentioned vulnerability, people tend to assume that is a feminine opportunity, and I see the eye rolling, and I want you to talk about that, please, because you probably broach the topic of vulnerability with your CEOs who are male and female, I would think. Okay,
I would say if I'm making someone cry, it happens. It's probably twice as likely it's a man than a woman, because there's just we're getting into things that men have believe and have been told that they need to pretend those vulnerabilities aren't there. So when you kind of chip away at them, then right, it's very hard for them. Okay, vulnerability. So humans are vulnerable. There are, of course, major gender differences in whether that vulnerability is admitted, whether it has an outlet, all those sorts of things. So that's very different. There is also, it's so interesting because men don't tend to ask me questions about vulnerability. Women ask me the questions. How can I be vulnerable? Won't I be seen as weak? Won't I, I get that question all the time. Men don't ask the question, but it's not that I believe that they're not just as worried about it. Absolutely. It's just they don't even yet feel safe to ask me the question. So my vulnerability secret is always combining vulnerability with accountability. And I think this is the ultimate formula for all good things in teamwork. So vulnerability to me, vulnerability is also highly correlated with integrity. When we pretend we don't struggle, there is so little integrity in that. We put forward something that makes other people feel nervous about their own imperfections. Like there's a big problem in pretending that we don't struggle. So struggling foster and admitting struggle fosters connection among humans. That's the trust begets trust, vulnerability begets vulnerability. So if we pretend we're not vulnerable, it is a loss and it erodes connection between us. So we don't want to do that. But if we are just vulnerable without taking accountability, it erodes confidence, right? You just look at somebody and you're like, oh, I'm not feeling so good about counting on you anymore. And I'm not really sure that you can pull yourself together. Vulnerability without accountability is a big problem. So pairing it with accountability is, I'm struggling with this. I would love to be able to share it with you. But I'm not giving you my problem. I am asking you to sit with me while I work through the problem. I'm probably not even asking you to say a word. I just really need a safe place that I can talk through this. Often, and we've all had this experience, right? You start talking about your problem, and as you talk about it, you're like, it gets a little easier. And then you say, well, I could do this. And then you're like, thank you. And the person's like, I didn't say a word.
Right.
You're like, I know, but you created a safe space for me to say these things. So accountability is, I'm struggling and I know I own this. And so I'm going to keep going. I'm going to figure out a way. I'm going to demonstrate that, I have to take this and get myself to a solution to it. When you put those two things together, you become the most respected, sought after, loved person, because vulnerability without accountability is bad, but accountability without vulnerability, there's no connection there. And we've probably all had managers where they were like highly accountable, but there was nothing between you. You wouldn't have, thrown yourself in front of a bullet for them. You wouldn't have even let me log in on my vacation to help you because I do anything for you. People who are just accountable with no vulnerability really lose the benefit of human connection. So when we put these two things together, magic happens. So I'm a crier. And so when I used to work in an organization with my boss, every once in a while I'd feel projectile crying. But I trained him. I'd always say, like, my brain is okay. I'm good. I'd like to keep going. And always within about 2 minutes, the crying was gone. I was on to like what I needed to do. So if we could get to healthy workplaces, we would be at a place where it is absolutely normal to talk about our vulnerabilities, to have each other's back in vulnerability. But it would be just as important that in those situations that we don't transfer accountability, we don't play a victim, but we kind of keep the ownership and keep moving.
I appreciate that. I think others may have the examples in their own mind where that topic has come up and is dealt with differently. And I love the fact, because you talked about one of the things we need to do is with our teams, with our organizations, effective communication. So letting your boss know that I'm a crier,
Yes.
Who would have thunk it? Who would have thunk it, right? But that having effective communications up front, clear communications, and you highlight that so many times. I keep thinking about associates, and I had this conversation with a couple of different associates recently whose partners are not giving them clear information, clear instructions, and then on the other side are not giving them clear feedback either, and they're not sure what to do. So again, being able to set that tone early on, regardless of what your level within the organization is, expect and offer clear communications right from the get-go. I think that you made that statement a couple of times. Early on, get it as early on. Can you early something if it doesn't happen early on? Can it be recovered if it's not a practice that happens later on?
Yeah, it can. But again, you've already damaged your credit rating a bit. Right.
There's a
that phenomenon where you meet somebody like 3 or 4 times and they're like, oh crap, I don't know their name and I can't ask their name now. Like I'm such an idiot because like, who's the loser who didn't ask 4 times? Like, I can't ask now. Well, it's the same. Like, if I've let this ride 4 times, like, I can't now say that's not okay with me. Like, so, yeah, it's certainly easier to do it
Okay.
from the beginning. And when you do it at the beginning, it's no big deal, right?
Yeah.
So that's, that's a key piece of the puzzle. Let me just say one more point about crying and vulnerability. And this is something provocative I've been saying recently, just to put it out into the world. I think the taboo against vulnerability expressed as crying is fading. I think we have a massive gender bias going on in our organizations because the taboo against vulnerability expressed as yelling is still absolutely taboo. And so then I say, okay, so why is it that natural human emotion expressed in an estrogen-based pathway is okay, and natural human-based vulnerability expressed in a testosterone pathway is not okay? And I think that's not cool. I think we can't make the world more humane for half the population. And because how vulnerable would you feel if you're somebody whose temper gets a hold of them? Because when I say to somebody, I'm crying, I don't mean to cry. I'm not doing it to be manipulative. I don't intend it. Like, why is that okay? And somebody saying, I'm so sorry I raised my voice. It, like, I kind of lost it for a moment there. It wasn't my intention. I'm not trying to, scare you or anything else. So I think one of the things we have to think really seriously about is, have we made one version of natural human emotion okay in the workplace and one taboo? And I think most places we have.
Interesting. I want to hear what others have to say about that, because I still think crying is taboo in the workplace. And then from a legal perspective, I've oftentimes heard new students or new associates use the phrase, my supervisor yelled at me. And, well, is it yelling, or is it just, they were in the middle of a case and they were just sort of giving that information? Both have that possibility of being taboo. So something to take back and think about. I'll open it up in a few minutes, and I'm gonna ask people just to think about their comments and their questions. As I ask this last question for now, you've got a couple, not or more than a couple. You've got really great templates, and I want you to walk us through your clarifying expectations, the U tool, and then normalizing tensions. That was a little nerve-wracking for me. Normalizing tensions was the TARP, and I loved how you used the example. Can we just walk through each of those, and then we'll open up to questions?
Yeah, so the U is basically an exercise to help people realize that one of the reasons we get into conflict, and very unproductive conflict, is because we aren't clear about expectations. And so people don't know what value to add. So that tool actually goes through and clarifies for different levels in an organization, what's the value you need to add to position other people to succeed. And so that's that tool. And what you'll find is there are a million lessons that come from that tool. What happens if leaders are micromanaging? What happens if leaders are not adding value proactively, but only adding it reactively? There's so many lessons that come from that one. The TARP is called the TARP because it comes from, I was looking for an alternative to the rowing metaphor, and an alternative to the, like, we're all supposed to be pulling in the same direction. And it came from a story of taking the kids camping many, many years ago now. And realizing that when you're trying to spread a plastic tarp out over a tent, everybody's pulling in a different direction in order to make that scarce resource, that piece of plastic, go as far as you can to keep everyone in the tent dry. And so the exercise is one that has you really articulate for each role on the team, what is the rope that they are pulling and how is it different? So what's the expertise that that role is bringing to the table, and how is it different and distinct and unique from what other people are bringing? Who are the stakeholders that are not in the room that role is obliged to advocate for, and therefore what's the tension they need to put on discussions? And it's really an exercise in organizational empathy. And when you go through this exercise, first of all, it's very fun, because sometimes when we start doing the exercise and I say, okay, what's the value that that group brings? Often they'll be like,
they have no value.
I'm like, okay, well, let's work on it for a little bit. So it's really, really funny. It was funny. I was with them I was with a big regional municipality a couple of weeks ago, and we were with the public works department of the regional municipality. And so we were doing the exercise, and it was funny because there were, I don't know, 30 tables or something in the room. And I said, okay, pick 3 different groups that are within the region that are often in tension with one another. And like almost every table picked procurement as the one they were going to do first. And so I went to one table. I'm like, okay, so what's the unique value of procurement? And that was the one where they're like, and when I asked them questions and got them to engage with it and really think about it, and when they finally, the light bulbs went on of why procurement is so important, it was just this epiphany. It was so powerful. And so when you understand that that person from procurement is not being a jerk, that person from procurement is making sure that, you know, infrastructure investments that are not only going to live for the life expectancy of people in the community today, but probably for 3 generations that aren't even born yet. And that making sure that it's the right choice and the right vendor to do that. Well, it's good that somebody's putting attention on that. And, you know, we used to, you know, give out these tenders based on like who knew whom and who was related. And, you know, so we have to defend our local businesses by having a fair and transparent process. Good thing we have them. So when they went through this and they understood, oh, so if I need to get that, I should be engaging with them sooner so they have more chance to add that value. And yes. So it was very powerful.
Yeah, and I'm glad, again, another metaphor issue for you, that you're using the tarp based on your camping trip with your daughters.
My ill-fated camping trip.
I'm going to turn it over to the group if they have any questions or comments. I saw one comment before about being trained in teamwork, that was build it and they will come kind of perspective. And I wondered if Anne, if you have any comments on that. But let me just pause. I've got a couple of other questions that we can talk about, but I wanted to open it up first. Let me just
ask me anything.
Ask her anything.
Yeah, hit me with something juicy.
Sandra, thank you. Welcome. Good to see you.
First off, I just want to say I love the book. It was so good. And, you know, you did sprinkle the humor in. So, you know, I am conflict averse, and even reading about it makes my heart rate go up.
I'm with you. I'm so with you, Sandra.
So my question, and hi, everyone. I am a practice management coach. So I deal with this, you know, with clients. My question is about your recommendations about dealing with this transparently in a team, where people are openly admitting where they land on the conflict spectrum, you know, and I do use that tool, the one that you mentioned at the beginning.
Thomas Kilman, yep.
Yeah. So what are your recommendations about being transparent about, you know, your group, and where do people land, and how do we work together to help everybody, you know, navigate conflict? Or is this more of a one-on-one safe conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't do any one-on-one work. So if I'm doing it in the room.
Right.
And it really depends on the current state of psychological safety in the team. So my facilitation philosophy is only have a conversation when the team is ready to have it productively. So I may be holding back on an assessment like that for a couple of sessions until we've slowly gotten closer. They've built confidence in me that I will protect them if something awkward happens in the conversation, those kinds of things. But generally a tool like the Thomas Kilman is pretty safe. One of the other good things is that tool is one that says, look, each of those conflict strategies is suitable for certain scenarios. And what you learn in doing it is, oh, I'm probably overusing this one. And so, you know, instead of it being somebody saying like, well, I'm great at conflict, and so I don't need this seminar. Well, where are you overdoing conflict? Where is it an overstrength? How is it landing with other people? Where are you creating conflict on things that don't need your conflict, where that slows things down? But also the people who maybe think that they're just the nicest people around, but what they're doing is they're compromising their own needs and, making them subservient to somebody else's. And where does that not serve the client? Where is that not helping the practice to evolve? So the Thomas Hillman is a pretty safe tool to have that kind of conversation. The other thing you can do is, because they can fill it out just for themselves, you don't necessarily have to tabulate the data. You don't need to share or have everyone share. You can have somebody say, does anybody err on the side a little too much of this? Does anybody, and, do it in a more voluntary way. But as long as there's some base level of psychological safety, I think broaching those things with a trained professional in the room is usually relatively safe.
Mhm. Thanks for your answer. I think that if you can arrive at that safe place, it's probably faster than doing it one-on-one.
Yeah, exactly. And ultimately, if it's a team issue, you're never going to
Yeah.
fix a team issue one-on-one.
No.
So at some point you have to make the leap into the room. And so it's a matter of, okay, how do we do that with them feeling like, okay, you've got our backs, we know. And so if somebody says something uncomfortable, like, my job in the room is always to have the back of the person that's on the receiving end of something that could be hurtful. So I will very quickly show them by how I respond to the person who said something that might be hurtful, or I will show them that I will lend my heft and my credibility to you in this room. And that helps people feel like, okay, Liane's, at least the influence she has is going to come down on my side if I need it.
Thank you.
That supports the psychological safety.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments that have come from some of the
Yeah,
discussion or in the book?
yeah.
Sorry. As you're thinking about things, let me just ask this. I found that in the first read through of the book, Liane, and I don't know if others felt this way. I thought, oh my God, there's so much to do, and to do it right and to do it well. And I was getting a little overwhelmed. So what would you say to anybody who is worried about the opportunity to do this well? Because we want to be able to have conflict, deal with our conflict credits and have productive conflict, but there's so much here. And you correctly stated at one point, it takes time, effort, and practice. So thank you for reminding us, just like anything else, it does take time, effort, and practice. But what do you say to somebody who feels a little overwhelmed, saying, I don't want to muck up, or I don't want to do it imperfectly?
Doing it imperfectly and mucking up is one of the absolute best opportunities you have.
Okay.
So when you muck up, if something's come out of your mouth and you wish you could grab the speech bubble back and like slow-mo, like, right? We've all had those moments.
Well done.
So if that happens, then right in the moment, be like, wow, okay, that didn't, the brain was not in touch with the mouth there. Like, that's not how I intended to say that, or I just heard that come out my mouth, and whew, that was not what I want to be. So when you mess up, you reinforce what good looks like and reinforce what not good looks like. That's a really healthy thing. Then you just go, I'm so sorry. Like, my intention here is to actually understand how you're thinking about this before I even worry about how I'm thinking about this. Can we have a do-over? I'm going to shut up. Please, like, take me through your thinking. So if it happens in the moment, just do that. If like you just feel righteous and you just bang away at your truth in the meeting, and it's like at 3:00 in the morning that you're like, oh, then the next day you start the day with wow, so that had me up for an hour. And as I was reflecting on our meeting, I'm really not happy with how I expressed that, or I didn't give you the space to, tell me how that was landing with you. Can we have a do-over today? Like, I'll buy the coffee or whatever. You may not even realize it because self-awareness is very low, and maybe somebody else tells you. And then first of all, you say to that person, I'm so grateful that you told me that. That is not my intention, and I didn't realize I did that. And then you go back to the original person. You're like, I am so indebted to Gina for telling me how that might have come across, and do this. So when you mess up, First of all, it's emotionally salient, and we learn better when things are emotionally salient. So, it's going to be emotionally salient for everyone on the team. And you saying, I messed that up, is going to reinforce good behavior much, much more than it encourages bad behavior. So don't be afraid to muck up. But the other thing is, like learning a golf swing or everything else, you can't fix everything, or a pickleball swing. You can't fix everything all at once. So pick one thing for a month and say, this month, I'm going to work on my level 3 listening. I'm really going to work on, kind of hearing not just what people are saying, but hearing what they're feeling and understanding what they're valuing. That's going to be for my month. And I'm going to jot a quick note at the end of each day on what did I learn when I listened for something different? Don't try and fix it all at once. That's not going to work.
Don't use everything all at the same time. I appreciate that thought as well.
Yeah.
Let me ask, before I want to share your cheat sheet. If others haven't gone on to it, I went on, I love the cheat sheet, but let me just ask if there's any other comments or questions before we almost are getting to lose Liane. So comments or questions?
I have a question. I'm dealing with the situation, and oddly, I'm sorry I didn't get through the book, but I will be finishing it tonight because I have a meeting scheduled tomorrow, and it's going to be really helpful.
We'll short circuit it for you here.
I have a situation at work where there's a conflict that's being created by one individual with a number of other individuals. Management has acknowledged that, yes, this person's problematic, but doesn't want to do anything about it because she cries. And yeah,
it's not lethal. You don't have to call 911. You don't have to wear a hazmat suit.
I've been doing avoidance. Fortunately, I laid the foundation in terms of the things that I want to talk about, which I'm thinking, yay me for having done that. But how do I deal with a situation where the person in authority who can actually deal with it or bring people together to deal with the issue refuses to do anything, and the person who is causing the conflict is standoffish and refusing to even get in the room with everybody else?
Yeah. So the person, the leader who's not dealing with it, I think that's where you go back to, what is it that matters to that person that's being affected by this friction existing in the team? Start there. My experience over the last few weeks is that this person's behaviors is affecting people's willingness to work on the file or their collaboration on whatever. Here's the behavior I'm seeing, and here's the impact I'm seeing. Then I think what you want to do, likely what's going on is that person just doesn't even want to cope with trying to address it. So, ask it as something like, what do you see as some small way we could start to address this? Can we talk this through? And the other thing you might have to do is say, what could I do that would, move us in? Because the person is probably just I don't want to deal with this. There's no crying in baseball, whatever crap. And they're wrong. And they're degrading themselves as a leader because of it. And you're not going to fix that overnight. So I think go to something that they care about, that is something related to the business or their reputation or whatever else. And then talk about how the current state is affecting that, and then engage on, what do you think is causing this behavior? What might be effective? Who has influence with that person? Who could help them, see the impact of their behavior? That conversation. With the person who doesn't want to get in a room, well, they don't want to get in a room because they know that they're about to get an intervention, and they're about to get, I get it, right? They have a guilty conscience. They know that if they walk in the room, everybody's going to yell at them. And, I wouldn't walk in the room either. So, where are the safer spaces to have that conversation one-on-one? to broker, what are you hearing? What are some of the opportunities? But asking somebody who's perceived as the bad guy to walk into a public tarring and feathering is not going to be effective. The other thing
Yeah.
is, if
It
that
wouldn't
person,
even be that. She's
Yeah.
the one who causes the issues. She's
Right.
the one who's yelling at everybody and acting very passive aggressively. So it wouldn't
Yeah.
even be confrontation.
so go back to the yelling. So people think of yelling as this sign of like strength or power. I'm going to say yelling is an ultimate sign of vulnerability. What it means is I don't feel heard, I don't feel understood, and I can't get what matters to me without resorting to this very ineffective technique. So think about her differently, right? We immediately go to thinking of that person as the wicked person, as the as the bully, as the whatever. Psychologically, I don't think that's what's going on.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
So I think the asking the questions is the one tactic I have not tried yet, because
Try
this has
that.
been going over 2 years.
So I
So
think you
thank
can
you.
ask her, what are people not understanding? Where do you feel that we're not addressing or paying attention to the right things? What is the most important thing that you believe needs to be different? Like those kinds of questions that leave room for, so the line I use all the time is, if the dragon is breathing fire, it's because they're protecting treasure.
Yeah.
So she's protecting treasure. And what happens is we tend to like just put a bunch of bricks in the wall between us. And what you need to do is get her to open the drawbridge.
Yeah. Thank you.
What are the questions to get her to open the drawbridge so you can understand there is treasure there? Something is going on that she feels she's not being heard, that she's not doing an effective enough job of convincing other people. And that's why you're getting that aggression. But it's a sign of her failing, not of a sign of her, being.
Thank you very much. That's so helpful.
My pleasure. And let me know. I want to know which treasure the dragon is protecting.
That dragon analogy is fabulous. It helps, but it's a perspective, right? The analogy of the dragon, the fire, the treasure, and the drawbridge. That is so vivid in my mind. So
yeah, learning to ask great open drawbridge questions, because this person who's been perceived as a bad guy for 2 years probably feels like it's been 2 years since anybody gave a damn about this thing that she must care so much about that she's willing to piss everybody off over it, right? So if you go in there being like, I really want to understand, what are we not paying enough attention to? What have we been ignoring? What are we missing? Those kinds of questions, nice projective open questions, she'll lead you to the treasure.
And thanks for that question. Really helpful.
Great question.
Any other comments or questions for Liane?
Liane, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the book. The one part that really stayed with me was in the book several times you mentioned how it's important to validate and respect people in the conversation. And the first time I actually encountered this and saw what a difference it makes was with my children. My husband and I had a parenting coach who taught us how to connect with children and mirror. And it never occurred to me that would make a difference, but it made a huge difference. And our fights became more enjoyable, if I can say so. They weren't enjoyable, but they were, less stressful for everybody. And what you just said, how yelling is actually a reflection of somebody's being in the corner in a way, and not knowing what to do. There was much less yelling in our house.
We only yell when we can't get to what we need in a better way.
Yeah.
And that's the same for me with crying. Like I only cry if I'm so frustrated and I just, right.
Yes.
I finally had to teach my boss, who I taught how to handle crying. I finally had to tell him, just so you know, like for the most part, when women are crying at their bosses, it's because you're idiots and we're so frustrated that you can't figure it out. And he was like, I was like, oh yeah, it's not that we're weak. It's that we're so infuriated by how you just don't get it.
Yeah.
I love it. Here's how he took that, but I love the.
He was great. He was actually. It was so funny because when I left the company 8 years ago, couple of years later, he had 2 boys and then a girl a few years later. And I got an email like literally years after he had been my boss saying something about, he wanted to thank me for how I had trained him about dealing with crying, because this teenage daughter, he felt way more capable to handle her because he'd had to handle me. Yeah.
Thumbs up for that.
Yeah,
And that's part of the book, Liane, that I really welcomed, is that end. I think you called it a bonus chapter, because it's not just in the organizations that this all comes up, but in our own family dynamics with partners or with children or with friends, or even in, you really wonderfully added, volunteer work that we do. And so again, that the extension that teams, conversations, conflict is really helpful in productive conflict, is helpful in a variety of the relationship that we have. I think was a good reminder, a good eye opener. So thank you for that vulnerability to do that. I'm going to share it in case people haven't gotten on to, she lists the tip sheet, or the cheat sheet. My apologies. And can you speak for 2 minutes about the tip sheet? And I'm going to try and call it up on the screen as well.
Yeah. So what I was trying to do is give you ways to start sort of sprinkling. So the metaphor I use is like, if you read the book and then all of a sudden, just like when you have a New Year's resolution to eat healthy. And so like on January 3rd, you make this batch of like spelt brand gluten-free muffins, and you take one bite of that and it's like, and then you never have it again. The same with conflict. You don't want to come out of the gates just being like, and then you have a bad reaction from your teammates, and so you give up. So this is the equivalent of like, still have your cornflakes, but just sprinkle a little all bran on them to start with, right? So it's just things like, people put out so-called facts all the time that we just kind of take them at face value. And one way of just starting to add some tension to conversations is to just ask, like, what are you basing that on, or that sort of thing. Exploring a different side is like, yeah, I totally see how that makes so much sense from our suppliers' perspective. How do you think it's going to land with our clients? Or so represent a stakeholder, explore a different side. These are just a variety. So a contingency is just, I love that plan. Now I'm just wondering, how would it play out if this happened instead of the assumption? Or so it's just little ways, because I think right now we're so conflict fragile that, people put out an issue in a meeting and they kind of hope that everybody's response is like, yes, exactly, check, right? And that anything that challenges or questions is, we're just so quick to be offended or hurt or whatever. So these are just little ways to start building up your team's conflict muscles and tolerance, as opposed to the big, horrible mouthful of gluten-free brand muffins, which no one can quite swallow.
I love that. And again, a little bit at a time, and maybe one at a time, practicing that a little bit until you feel like you get better at it. And then bringing your team on board with these as well, so that, sharing this document with them, in terms of the cheat sheet, share that with them so that they have those ideas of sprinkling on as well.
Yeah, you can actually make those 9 things on the cheat sheet. You can make them part of your team decision-making process. Like, let's go around and make sure we do 4 or 5 of these on before we, as we're deliberating, before anyone makes a decision. Like, you can actually make that into the process. And the other thing I love about conflict in a remote work environment, so many of us working through Zoom, like, you can have notes, you can have the right way of saying something, you can have phrasing in front of you, which, if you're in a meeting room, you have to like write it on your hand, you look like a bit of a dork. But the big advantage we have right now is so often we're having these conversations remotely, and we can have a few notes to ourselves, or a post-it note on your screen, or things to help you say things in a way that's going to be a good fight.
You have given us some phenomenal metaphors, some phenomenal tools.
I told you, my metaphors per minute, I aim to have that very.
Love it. You reached that for sure. I've listed here an email and your website. I think that's the one that you'd prefer, www.lianedavey.com. And then your email with the 3co's.com as well. I wanted to thank you, Liane, because again, even just the thinking about conflict, I think Sandra said it, gave me a little bit of the nervous tension, but being able to see it as a positive and thinking about it in a way to really support growth and development and our communities, whatever those communities are, was a really helpful concept to put ourselves to. So thanks for testing us, for tension, getting that tension going. Really grateful to you. Grateful to everybody for joining us. Remember, if you are a lawyer, you have your 1.5 hours to claim. But again, thank you, Liane, for taking your time today and for writing this book, which is really important.
As I said, I wrote it for me because I needed it. I'm so glad it serves others as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month, and take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.